It's time for the swimmer among the stars, Kanishk Tharoor in conversation with Baradwaj Rangan. I invite Mr. Kanishk Tharoor and Baradwaj Rangan to take their seats on stage, please.
Good evening, everyone. We are here to talk about Swimmer Among the Stars, which is a collection of short stories by Kanishk Tharoor. Uh, I'll begin with a question I like to ask all writers. What do you think about the whole people are reading less uh, mantra that people keep talking about, that you know, there's all this writing being produced, but just people aren't just reading enough?
Hi, Baradwaj. Thank you for having me here. It's really good to be in Chennai. Before I answer the question, I just want to say that it's really great to be in Chennai. This is only the second event I've done around this book, and I really couldn't imagine a nicer venue for it and to be in the open air. Um, but yeah, this question about reading less, it's funny. On the one hand, anecdotally, I think you're right. I'm the oldest of a big brood of cousins, and you see as you go down in age how they read less and less and less, and that reading isn't a natural habit, that there's so many other ways of consuming entertainment and culture, and that reading ranks very low amongst them. But at the same time, statistically, it's interesting. You see, well, this is at least in the US, I think you see that young people actually read more than older people. So people have been forecasting the death of the novel and the death of reading for a little while, and I wouldn't be too drawn into doing it. My one worry is that, in some respects, writing and reading have always been elite activities since the beginning of time, until about 200 years ago. I think around the world, especially with the advent of mass culture and the printing presses, you saw a democratization of reading. And my worry is that with the diminished interest in reading and the competition from other forms of consuming culture, from TV, from the internet, that reading will again become a kind of rarefied niche activity. And that would be unfortunate. But on the outset of it, I don't know. It's difficult to judge whether that's really true.
So let me put the same question to you in a more personal fashion. Do you worry that the writing that you produce it's possible that it may not attract as many readers as, say, had you written the same thing maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago? That's what
I have to confess that when I write, and maybe this is a bad thing to say as a writer, I'm not really imagining an audience.
Okay.
I'm not really imagining who I'm writing for. I write purely to satisfy my own imagination, my own interests. So that very well may be true, but it's not a concern I've had in the process of my writing.
Okay. You just talked about democratization of reading, but we've also seen a democratization in the way readers approach journalism or writing, in the sense that, earlier people used to pick up specific publications and say, that's a place you went to for good reading, but now people don't really care where the writing came from, even if it's a local, publication, as long as the content is good, they go out and read it. So I wanted to ask you if you think there's something similar happening in fiction, whether the brand has become less, that is the brand as in the author, has become less important than the content.
Well, I mean, if you look at two very big examples in the United States recently, where you had the great success of Karlovic and Ferrante in the United States, who wasn't a particularly well-known writer, and was published in the US by a very small press, Archipelago Books. And likewise, the Italian writer Elena Ferrante, who've both been widely, massively, hugely successful. And she was also published by a very small press in the United States. You see there that it doesn't really matter what sort of industry branding you have behind you, you can be successful despite that. At the same time, people have been talking about the decentering of power beyond just fiction, in all sorts of aspects of life and in the production of knowledge, whether it's Wikipedia or something else, that the traditional institutions that defined authority and defined certainty in the world have been somehow decentered or displaced in the last 20 years, principally by the rise of the internet. I don't know how. I don't want to get swept up in that kind of internet servitude. I still think that the traditional powers in the industry, the big publishing companies, still have a lot of influence, and I think we still see in terms of the brands of authors that it really makes if you have that brand, it can obviously make a big difference in how you're read, how you're received, how you're treated as a writer.
Okay. What about recognition? You've been nominated for a National Magazine Award for your short fiction. How important are these recognitions? They're obviously important in a personal sense because you're putting out something into the void and you don't know what's going to happen, and then this great thing happens and it's good for you. It's just like a pat on the back or whatever you want to call it. But I'm talking again about from the industry point of view. We just talked about the branding of the author. Now, do you think this kind of branding also helps? I mean, do you think publishers say, oh, you know what, this person has been nominated for this award and therefore let's, pick him up? Or does that factor into the kind of equation at all? Do you have any, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so I was nominated for this award that in the US is of decent consequence. Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. Apologies if I was being too quiet before.
Me too? Okay, sorry. Oh, she told me earlier.
So the question was, how significant are awards? I think from the perspective of a young writer who, I'm really building my career here, these kinds of awards, nominations are definitely of value. And I'm grateful for them. This specific award, I think, was one of the reasons why I was able to get an agent in the United States. So it had instrumental use from the get-go. But again, this is all fairly new to me. I don't want to presume too much. I wonder, as writers are more established, I think these awards lose a bit of meaning. But certainly, my days as a writer are solitary, are hermetic almost, and you're writing into a void all the time. So to have, especially at an early stage, to have that kind of external recognition is beyond its instrumental value, is really, it's a validation. Right. And it's encouraging, and it is a pat on the back. But then again, the awards can be arbitrary, they can be fortuitous. I don't want to inflate their importance. But I'm grateful for them if and when they come.
So, now there's a question I've got to ask you because your father's in the audience. But has being Shashi Tharoor's son been a bit of a problem in terms of carving out your own identity? Because I've been reading some recent articles about you, and there was one about your collection of short stories, which is Swimming Among the Stars. And it says, Shashi Tharoor's son tells stories too. So I was wondering if you were mildly annoyed by that, or...
I mean, I don't want to blame the journalist for the sins of the sub-editor. I don't think the people who have written about my collection and about me have necessarily wanted to frame their articles in that way. But I'm not naive. I'm very grateful for my father, his role in my life. We were very close, and I have so much pride for everything he's achieved here and in his previous career, and in his writing as well. So it's an honor to have a father like him. And I recognize that it's incumbent upon me and my work to succeed, so that I can avoid headlines like that.
Let's talk about your writing itself. Do you have any rituals?
You know, I'm quite inconsistent in the way that I write. So I don't know if I have rituals as such. I drink a lot of tea
Okay.
while I write, probably too much. You know, I love this story that about Orhan Pamuk when he was, you know, still finding his feet, and he was living, I think, for a time in New York City, and he didn't have a job, and his wife was teaching at Columbia, I think, and his days were his own to take care of and to organize. And what he would do was that when his wife would get up in the morning and go to her office and do the work she had to do professionally, and while he had nothing to do, he would likewise get up, get dressed, walk out with her, you know, in his jacket and tie, then walk around the block, and then return to his house because he had nowhere else to go, and begin writing as if he'd gone to his office. And that is something I actually try to do because I work from home. But I find, especially in the New York winters, that it's too cold and I'm too lazy to even get dressed like that. And it's far easier to slump off in my tiny apartment in my pajamas to my laptop and just get cracking like that.
Okay. Again, about this particular book, so I just wanted to ask you a bit about writing a short story, because with a novel, for instance, you start and it kind of goes on till it ends, and it ends when it ends. But with pieces of short fiction, they're a little more difficult to hew to a schedule, because you have to switch off after each story and then switch on again for the next one. So how long did it take for you to put together the stories in this collection?
I think I might find it the opposite. I think I'm writing a novel simultaneously, and that to me is a much more unmanageable, amorphous task that seems like this impossible thing without end, and which I really can't schedule. Whereas short stories, I've often written in a very regimented way. I'll get an idea, I'll say to myself, I'm giving myself, you know, a week or 2 weeks to get a first draft, and I can sit down and devote myself to it in a very kind of military way,
Okay.
which I find much more difficult for the novel I'm writing. But these stories themselves, most of them, to be fair, were written in the last 5 years at a point when I had begun to just devote myself to my craft of fiction. I had previously flirted with academic history, and I also am a journalist, which I still do from time to time. But in the last 5 years, in a more concerted way, I'd begun writing, committing myself to fiction. But there are stories here. The oldest story in the collection was written when I was about 18 or 19 in college. There's another story, The Tale of the Tea House, that was written when I was about 22. So in the period of the last 10 years, these stories have been cobbled together.
Did you find that you had to make a lot of adjustments to the story, edit the story that you wrote when you were 19?
I have to confess that I did not make many changes to that, though it is the one story that I look at in the collection, I think, my God, I was so young then.
Which one is it?
The Loss of Muzaffar.
Okay.
It's about a man in post 9/11 New York. But no, I didn't actually make many changes to that story for this edition. And you know, I think actually, in many ways, I think the bulk of the stories, though they are often on various different themes, different time periods, different geographic locales, I think they are united by a pretty consistent tone that I think stretches across the breadth of the collection, and I think is what unites sort of the ethos, that sort of produces the ethos of the book, which is the tone that I think that the stories achieve.
Would you like to read something from it?
Sure. I thought I might read from the beginning of the title story of the collection, which is going to take me a little while to find. Sorry, forgive me. Okay. The title story of the collection, Swimmer Among the Stars, is it's about. For a while I've been interested in endangered languages. And this is something that is not just an abstract subject for me. Actually, in New York City, where I live, New York City has proven to be one of the major laboratory, sort of last repositories of endangered languages. There are languages spoken in New York that are no longer spoken in Bangladesh or Indonesia or Kenya and other countries around the world, but have survived in diaspora in New York City. And there's a wonderful organization that's going about recording these languages and recording their vocabularies and grammatical systems, but also some of the sort of thought systems that are implied in those languages. And so this story sprung out of my interest in the demise of languages. We live in a period of time that has seen more languages disappear than any other period in history. And also, I think, as a writer who thinks in English, and I suppose also as a reader who thinks in English and consumes in English, it's a bit incumbent upon us to think about linguistic diversity when the hegemony of English and other big languages is so responsible for its demise. So I'll just read from the beginning of this story. As a rule, the last speaker of a language no longer uses it. Ethnographers show up at the door with digital recorders, ready to archive every declension, each instance of the genitive, the idiosyncratic function of verbal suffixes. But this display hardly counts as normal speech. It simply confirms reality to the last speaker, that the old world of her mind is cut adrift from humans and can only be pulped into a computer. She finds it strange to listen to the sounds of her mouth. Inevitably, she mingles a more common language with her own. The common language, after all, is the speech that now keeps her company, that leads her through the market, that sits with her in the evenings by the television, that gives her the terminal diagnosis at the clinic, that pours through her letterbox, that comes in a crisp nurse's outfit to wash her feet. Her own language does nothing of the sort. It is nowhere to be found. She pauses, silent now, staring incredulously at the microphone. How am I the last speaker of my language? How can I be its keeper? My language left me. She apologizes to the ethnographers. You must understand, she says, that though my memory is preserved better than a lemon, it is still difficult to remember which words are my own and which words are not. Please speak as it comes naturally to you, the ethnographers say. Thank you, I will try. In any case, we can help you remember. The last speaker looks up, puzzled. But if you know already, then why do you want to hear it from me? It means something more if it comes from you. Do you speak my language then? Do you understand me when I say this, when I say that, and even now when I am singing this song that my father sang every day as he disappeared down the valley? She sings and her alien words crackle about the room. No, we do not understand, the ethnographers say, or if we do, it is only distantly. Oh, that is a shame. It would be so nice to sing that song for someone. Please, madam, sing it for the microphone. She grins. So the microphone understands, does it? Yes, it understands. If only you could get microphones to talk. She laughs and then feels a little sorry for herself. She does not mean to sound sardonic. No one could accuse her of being indifferent to her plight. Some years before, it had occurred to her that she was no longer in the habit of hearing her own tongue. Everybody in the town seemed to be speaking the common language. She did not mind using their language, since she had dwelt in it for a long time, almost as long as she could remember, and had kept it clean and given it a good airing, rearranged the furniture so it suited her just right. It was the language of her husband and her children, and she had made it hers. But always, in the darker corners, she placed mementos of her own, a proverb, a snatch of rhyme, some light daily expressions, the glimpse of which would startle her family. With nobody to speak her language to, she began talking with objects, the pots and pans, a creaking door, the sharp corner of a table. She never spoke it with animals because, and here a foreign kind of pride sparked within her, it was never a language to waste on goats. Once, on a rare visit, her son came upon her in the living room speaking in tongues with a teacup. He told her she was going mad. No, she sighed, you don't understand. This is what a conversation sounds like. I think I'll stop there. I think I'll stop there for the time being, actually.
Okay.
But thank you for letting me read.
That was Swimmer Among the Stars. I just wanted to ask you about the titles of your stories, which I found quite lyrical and lovely. There was one called Elephant at Sea, and there was one called The Fall of an Eyelash, and then there was one called Portrait with Coal Fire. So, I mean, do they just come up, or I just wanted to know how you go about choosing a title. Does it just pop up and say, pick me, or?
This is actually quite a funny question to ask with my father in the audience because of probably his strongest kinds of criticism of my work. What he claims is my inability to give titles to my stories. So actually some of these titles were suggested by him, or at least we wrestled over them for a while. But no, I think, The Elephant at Sea actually was suggested by my publisher. It had a different title before then. I think my instinct has always been to give, because I do think my writing can tend to be a bit lyrical, so my instinct has always been to give the titles of my stories, make them very dry, very blunt, very bland. So it's funny that you see that they strike you as lyrical. I think many of them have become such under the pressure of external influences.
Many of them?
Many of the titles are what they are because they were suggested to me by others. Because what I was prone to do is, for example, there's the story Elephant at Sea, which is about the journey of an elephant from Casablanca to Rabat. I had initially just titled Casablanca to Rabat, which is, in retrospect, a terrible title. And so I was very happy when somebody who's read this story and imbibed it from the outside could step away from it and help me come up with a better, more succinct, more evocative title, like Elephant at Sea.
Yeah. So I find it interesting that you say that that your writing tends to get lyrical, and therefore you'd like a dry title, you called it, because I thought one of the strong points of this book, at least according to me, was the fact that you were not apologetic about being writerly. There's a tendency among a lot of recent writing to kind of be a little almost afraid to commit to things like, I don't know, alliteration or repetition, or like there's this there's this small phrase that struck me in Swimmer Among the Stars, platter of pastries. It's just a very small phrase, but and then there's you repeat words for effect. For instance, in the story Letters Home, there's a sentence: he thought Indians were black and shameless. Appreciate insight then, since so many Indians now deride their own countrymen as black and shameless. Things like that typically are blue penciled, and I don't know. So I was wondering if you're a little conscious about being seen as too writerly, because that's kind of because lyrical, writerly, it's all kind of the same bucket, I guess. So.
Well, this is. I think I often write the way I think and talk,
right?
And there's really nothing else I can do but do that. And if there are occasional moments of alliteration, that's probably also because when I speak, I tend to that kind of alliteration as well. And a sentence like that, I think that repetition for effect makes sense in the context of that sentence, and I would stick by it. I enjoy language. I enjoy the sound of language. I think I have a very rhythmical, or I hope I have a very rhythmical sense of my prose, and I am unabashed about that. I also I don't know any other way to write.
Right.
This is what comes naturally from me. If it is writerly, then there's not much I can do.
I meant writerly as a good thing. So.
Well, it's interesting
it's nice to see because
I have recently, a few years ago, came out of the context of the American creative writing program, where this is something that's critiqued often, and that the highest goal is a kind of transparency. transparency in writing. And I don't know if my prose is necessarily transparent. I think I am committed to lyrical prose and artful prose, which at least that's what I aspire to. And I'm unabashed about that. I think, for me, one of the pleasures as a reader is to encounter that kind of language, and to inhabit the mind of an intelligent writer. So, since that's something I enjoy in my reading, I aspire to reproduce that in my writing as well.
Yeah, I mean, let me explain again, because see, for instance, you find everybody being so reverent about Nabokov, for instance. He's an extremely writerly writer. I mean, part of the pleasure of reading him is just to savor those sentences and how he constructs stuff, and there's all that great alliteration and all that stuff that. So you have, on the one hand, people admiring a writer like that, placing him on a pedestal, but nobody seems to want to write like that because they're being scared of being accused of being writerly. So that's where I was coming from. So.
Well, I mean, again, this is only my first book, and I wouldn't dream to put myself in the company of Nabokov, but if that is the effect of my writing, then I can't, I mean, I'm not inhibited about it.
I just thought I'd also talk about your opening sentences, since we were talking about writerly stuff. One of your stories begins like this: it takes only moments for an icebreaker in the Antarctic to come to the profound realization that it can no longer break ice. And here's another one that struck me. As a rule, the last speaker of a language no longer uses it. So, do you work on opening sentences?
I think with a lot of short stories that I've written, I've either had an opening line come to me, and then the work of the short story has been justifying the opening line, or often an image or another line elsewhere in the middle of the story, and the work of the story is building around that image and that line. And I think in the case of both those stories, I did have, the opening line sort of just came to me, and the rest of the story followed, and I never returned to the opening line thereafter.
Okay.
So I guess from a craft perspective, often these lines just appear to me fully formed, I guess.
Okay.
And get dropped into the laptop.
What about tense? Because there's some stories in past tense, some tense in present tense. How do you choose one over the other?
I'm trying to think which stories are in present tense and which stories are in past tense. I think I really enjoy writing in present tense. I like the immediacy of it. At the same time, my instinct as a narrator is to sometimes sweep to the omniscient, almost folkloric register, which can be better suited to past tense. Again, forgive me, but I'm forgetting which stories I've written in which tense now.
Do you want me to say?
Oh, if you have it off the top of your head.
I don't have it off the top, but I'll look it up.
In terms of a strategy, I don't. I think actually I found in my recent writing, I'm writing my novel right now, and that is in present tense. And it's in present tense because I'm actually writing about a period far away in the 15th century. And I think being in present tense helps a reader and helps me as a writer feel more grounded and immersed in that world. But I don't think that's necessarily the choice I would make in every case, in every story. And I do think I feel as comfortable writing in the past tense as I do in the present.
Okay. You also write nonfiction, and do you view fiction and nonfiction as separate streams? Now that you're writing a novel, do you find yourself writing nonfiction, or do you just say, I'm going to shut off that window and concentrate on my fiction for a while? And I also was curious about if one stream had impacted the other.
I think I have much more fun writing fiction. I enjoy writing fiction more than I enjoy writing nonfiction. For a while it had been that my nonfiction was a means of supporting my fiction, the journalism I was doing. It's less so now. That said, I hope to write both nonfiction and fiction, and for a long time I flirted with becoming an academic historian, and I definitely would like to write nonfiction history at some point, at a book length. And I am working on various nonfiction projects right now. Actually, it's strange to call this nonfiction, but I'm working on a radio series for the BBC that's going to be aired in about a month. That is on the destruction of antiquities in Iraq and Syria that I'll be presenting. So these are, and you'll see in the work of my fiction that there are a lot of subjects of contemporary relevance, of historical relevance that I tackle, and they are informed by, I suppose you could call them, my non-fiction interests in the world, my interests in the wider world. And in fact, I find reading non-fiction, whether books or even newspaper articles, magazine articles, to be highly generative for producing my fiction. There's a story in the collection called A Portrait with Coalfire that springs entirely from reading an article in National Geographic and its attendant photographs. There's a story that's a very imaginative one in the collection called United Nations in Space, which imagines a coterie of international diplomats trapped in near-Earth orbit because the Earth is unsafe for the United Nations, which was inspired by a real-life event in 2014 when a parliament in Libya couldn't meet because the country was too unsafe, so they fled to a Greek car ferry that was parked off in the Mediterranean. So I do think that my interests in the world and in current affairs and history bleed very directly into my fiction, and I suspect that they will continue to do so.
Okay. So tell us about this book you wrote the story you wrote as a 7-year-old about a naval captain in the Mauryan Empire. So.
To be very honest, I don't remember a huge amount about this story in particular. This is one of the first, it's funny that Baradwaj has seen this, but one of the first stories I wrote was about a sailor in the Mauryan Empire, which is a bit of a, I think, very improbable when you come to think of it. And there are other old little stories. I think the first story, my mother reminded me recently that the first story that they have was written when I was 6, and it's fancifully titled Sir Kanishk and His Magic Lamp. And I think you can imagine what the plot was like from the title. But it's funny that I did write this little story about a naval captain in the morning. I think I'd been reading a lot of probably my father's historical fiction that he read as a kid about pirates and so forth, and sort of inspired by that, I went off and wrote this story. And but I think it's interesting. It was recently when I was toying with the idea of doing academic history. One of the subjects that I had devoted myself to briefly was actually the Mughal Empire's relationship to the sea. So I've always been interested in the Indian relationship to the sea and to the world beyond.
Okay.
Beyond the bounds of this little story I wrote when I was 7.
So this is the question that gets asked a lot in literary sessions like this one about, you just said you did a master's or 2 years master's in creative writing in New York University. How do these courses help? In the sense that, you said both things. You said at one point that your writing comes from within you and that, there's a lot of you that you put into your writing. And at the same time, you also said that you attended this course where they favor a particular kind of style. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about if there was a conflict and more so about whether these courses help, because there are so many of them even in India and people keep joining them. And here we have workshops here maybe, but not maybe full-fledged courses, but you still have a few of them. And people are always curious about, do these help and how?
Well, I don't want to join the cottage industry of writers who complain about creative writing. But at the risk of doing that, first of all, these programs can be a real luxury, because often they'll support you for 2 years simply to do your reading and writing and to work on your craft in that time. And that is something that I can't complain about. They support you and they give you the freedom to do that. I don't know if writing can be taught. What I do think is that being involved in these programs in a rigorous way improves how you read. And I think I came out of those 2 years a much, much, much better reader of fiction, attentive to the way fiction works than I was before. When I think my habits of reading changed completely over the course of this program. And I think my ability to read more attentively and critically changed the way I made choices in my writing. Now, that's, sorry, it's a very qualified way of answering your question, but it's very different from saying that it made me that it improved my writing or taught me how to write. But I do think it helped my writing.
So, when you say that you joined the course and you became a better reader, and that you learned to write, you learned to read more attentively, and that informed your writing, do you think that the reader out there who has not been to this course and is just a casual reader, do you think that they would pick up on the things that you're trying to do, or is that not of concern at all? Because, you know, even a writer, if you say that you had...
I think when I say attentive reader, it's to the way it's to the way that that fiction operates at a level for everybody. It's not, you know, I think there's a big distinction in the creative writing world between, or rather in ways of reading between, say, a critical, scholarly, literary way of reading and a creative writing way of reading, which I think is still at the end of the goal of that is accessible work. So I do think rather that the kind of writing that this would produce would be accessible to your lay reader and isn't generating any kind of particularly niche or highly sophisticated kind of writing. But yes, I think the conversations that happen internally in the creative writing world can be very parochial, can have their own kinds of vocabulary that I think people outside don't care about. And I think the problem with the creative writing world is that they can generate the same kind of writing. You know, my frustration was that people were invested in talking about how you write, but there was no conversation about why you write or what you write about. So there was only conversation about craft, never really conversations about the merits of content. And that was my main frustration. But I should just say that I was so grateful for the experience I had and for all the support these kinds of institutions give you in the process of these degrees.
So my last question before we open up for questions is, do you have any advice for people who have writing dreams but don't have the luxury of taking it up as a full-time career?
This is only my first book, and I'm pretty, wet behind the ears still. So I can't dream to give people. It feels almost churlish of me to give grandiose kinds of advice. But I would only say that, I know I said at the beginning of the talk that I'm inconsistent in my writing, but I do try at all times to write a little, even if I have no time in the day, to write a little, to write 100 words or something a day, just so that I have a sense of momentum, of practice, that I never feel rusty. So write regularly. Obviously, again, I think to repeat what I said just 2 minutes ago, to read attentively and read critically. And I also suppose to write what you want to write and not to write what you expect other people not to write what you expect other people want you to write. So, to write what comes out of you, not what you expect to see in the world.
Okay. Thank you, Kanishk.
Thank you.
Any questions from the audience?
Hello. My son is about to graduate with a degree in computer science, but he wants to become a poor writer like me. What is your advice to him?
He should do it. But there's also
was
no
money
reason.
ever a concern?
There's no reason why he can't do both. Sorry?
Was money ever a concern for you when you decided to become a writer?
My wife and I live this sounds a bit pious, but we live fairly modest lives in New York City, and that's because we're both writers, and that's how we want to live. But I also had the benefit that I didn't have to support my parents. You know, one of the great privileges I have is that my parents didn't require my brother or me to support them and help them as we, through our 20s and now into our early 30s. It was really left to us to decide what we wanted to do with our lives and the interests we had. And so I'm really fortunate for that, and I wanted to do this, and I've managed independently to cobble a life together, and hopefully it'll go on from there.
Hi, I've read The Elephant at Sea and I thought it was really beautiful. My question is, obviously you write it in isolation and you're not really thinking about whom you're writing it for or who the audience is. But once it goes out there, is there a sort of ambition or a hope that you have for your story, and do you hope that it touches people, or is it all right that it's just out there in the world and that you're done with it and it's cathartic really to just get the story out there and that's enough? And basically, what is the ambition for your writing?
That's a good question. I hope that people read my work and enjoy it. I think at another level, my ambition for these stories, and probably for my novel as well, is that anybody reading in English, for the time being these stories are only available in English, that anybody reading English, no matter where they're from, whether India or the West or anywhere else, when they read my work, that they would feel as estranged and, you know, attached and related and familiar with the work, equally those two things. That my work is communicable to anybody across boundaries across geographical boundaries. And I think, you know, as you see, the stories in the collection range from all sorts of time periods, all sorts of geographical locations. And my hope is that in the way that I've written these stories, that doesn't pose a challenge to the reader, that anybody anywhere can access them and you know, find both things they relate to and things that they find some wonder in.
Kanishk, you write about the past as though it's happening right now. It's a very contemporary way of looking at history. And I was wondering, is history really dead to you? Because you don't seem to have a separation in your mind. Let's put it this way, you write about the present the way you write about history as well, as though both are equally alive. And I was wondering where that fascination with the past comes from. You don't have a compartment in your head about the 15th century was a long time away. It feels as though you're writing about something that happened yesterday.
Well, both my twin brother and I, my twin brother is also a writer, he works for the Washington Post. Both he and I, growing up, were just rabid, non-stop consumers of history from a very young age. We were sort of sponges, and we just soaked up lots of information. And I think, you know, history, you're right, I think it's a wonderful way that you phrased it. History doesn't seem separate from the present to me. It doesn't seem like its own place. It's a world in my imagination that I inhabit as much as the present day. And I think the ambition in some of my stories, because I'm particularly interested in arenas of history that are not so well known, that haven't been written about so much, that are slightly obscure, willfully obscure maybe. And so part of my ambition in my short stories, because you can write about history in a way, in fiction, in a way that you can't in nonfiction, in straight history, I think in an evocative way. So part of the ambition of my short stories was to imagine and conjure these lesser known but equally wondrous periods of history and moments in history and tell their stories. And I do feel them, I feel them at an emotional level and not just at a sort of visceral, at a sort of abstract intellectual level. The past really matters to me, and its stories matter to me.
We've been told that it's time, it's a wrap, so thank you so much for being here, Kanishk. We enjoyed having you here. Thanks, everyone.